Chapter 28. Dare frowned as she and Kelin followed Jacob. He'd called them over, and she didn't think they had a choice about whether to trail after him or not. She strained her neck back toward the far side of the settlement. She had wanted to make sure that Caleb was all right. The knight jerked his thumb to the path along the river. "Stables are this way." Golden and red leaves decorated the floor of the trail running astride the river before it curved into the hamlet. Dare squinted, trying to count the buildings, but they were assembled with and into the forest. The woodwork was the same shade as the trees, even with the colors and shades of autumn. She descried a bridge over a small stream running through the settlement, and it reminded her of how far away she was from home. The bridge in River's Bridge was thick and gray. This one was a quarter of the size, wooden, and carved with patterns of leaves. The captain poked his head around the corner of a large stable with a low shingled roof. Then he swaggered inside. "Spike!" He threw both of his hands wide and approached the massive horse. "I thought the storm readers would have speared you for dinner." Dare swore the horse narrowed his eyes. She asked, "How did they arrive before us? Did we really spend that long on the river?" Jacob spun on his heel toward Dare and Kelin and shrugged. "Now that we know the horses and this arrogant bully made it, how about lunch?" Behind him, Spike pawed the ground. "What about Thistle and Thalin?" Dare asked. "You heard the prince?" "Yeah, but something still doesn't feel right about all of this." She swallowed, but kept eye contact. The knight nodded. "Lots of things don't feel right, and I will check on them when I can. But I've got to take care of you two as well. Now come on, let's get something to chow on." He thumped Spike's shoulder and walked out of the stable. Kelin shrugged to Dare, and they trotted after him as he threaded between the slender buildings. They noticed the curling carvings and paintings were built into the design of the walls, instead of overlaid like portraits or tapestries. Jacob seemed to know his way, or at least he followed his nose and led them unerringly to the kitchens. Dare glanced up and realized it was the only building with smoke rising from it. Among the steaming bowls and fires, Evelyn rose from kneeling by the oven like a blossoming flower. She smiled and dipped in a half-curtsy. Her ruby dress seemed too bright in the kitchen, and she moved like a leaf in the wind without so much as a dusting of crumbs on her clothing. "You two may be the first humans here." She returned to the counter to stir a bowl that sweetened the air around them. Her smile dipped. "This is Riverfall Haven, made long before the Kelin created themselves, and it's one of our dear secrets." Her face darkened. "But not, I suspect, any more." Kelin shivered. "Then are we safe here or not?" Jacob scowled. "It should be harder for them to get here." "So we shouldn't risk staying?" Dare guessed. Jacob cleared his throat. "This place has too many people now, and one of them is bound to tell the Kelin." She nodded and slipped her hands behind her to hide the goosebumps along her arms. The knight straightened his shoulders as he turned back to the cook. "The Crown Prince has arrived, and alive, but I very much suspect that you knew already." She pursed her lips. "Indeed. I must apologize for not being there to aid at the attack." "But you're not a fighter," Dare started before petering out. Lady Eve nodded. "That is true. I had no idea of it. Perhaps the Kelin learned from last time." Dare scratched her head. "Why? How could you have had an idea?" Jacob and Evelyn exchanged a glance. She smiled again. "I meant that I had no idea of the attack when one is so logical in hindsight." She looked at the knight. "And you, taking humans under your tutelage as always." He held up his hands. "I'm the only one here qualified." "You don't seem to have time for anything else these days. It takes this horrible tragedy to even get you on our side of the mountains again." The knight retreated a step. "We haven't crossed the Riverfall Divide yet. I'm still not on the Indaleria side of—" She shot him a thin-lipped expression that could freeze fire. He backed up another step. I'm going back to check on Spike and the other mounts." He wheeled on his heel and vanished through an archway. Lady Eve stuck her hands on her hips and exhaled sharply. Dare frowned at the archway. Curious? He was the one who was hungry. Kelin coughed into his hand. "Anyway, I'm hungry myself." Evelyn shook her head. "You can't eat here. I'm creating for an event." She whipped the batter in the bowl so hard that several splatters escaped onto the floor and counter. "Which is?" Dare prompted. The elf gave her a stern look but said, "There is a meeting tomorrow of high-ranking elves who escaped the kingdom. That's common knowledge here in Riverfall, and not known anywhere else." She stopped stirring. "Children, forgive me, but please see one of the other cooks if you're hungry." Kelin bowed to her and then pulled Dare at the shoulder. They wandered farther into the kitchens and grabbed some bread bowls filled with hearty soup that no one seemed to be minding. Then they dashed deeper into the maze of buildings. They found a round room, open to the sky above, with a simple fountain in its center. They sat to enjoy their pilfered meal. Dare felt as if she could almost make out the words of the water's song as they tickled her ears. Around them, pictures that could have been real stood against the walls. Kelin wiped his chin. "This is the first time the elves have left us alone." He shivered. "And this place seems very weird." Dare nodded, choking down the last piece of soup-soaked bread. "You're right." She pushed herself to standing. "So let's explore." He frowned. "Are we allowed to?" She shrugged. "You heard Lady Eve. We may be the only humans ever to be here, so we should see all that we can." She darted out of the room, leaving Kelin to chase or be left behind. In the next room, a fresco of the constellations and the moon glimmered with a soft radiance. Dare pressed her nose against the wall and cupped her hands around her eyes. "It's glowing!" Then she spun toward the opposite wall. She stiffened and blurted, "Oh, we didn't see anyone, I'm sorry." The figures kept moving without acknowledging them. She gasped. It wasn't anyone. It was the painting. The people portrayed walked and even silently laughed. Several elves moved in a view of a valley in the mountains and continued to have an eternal, formal picnic. The life-size figures started their endless routine again, stepping into their beginning places as seamlessly as if it were planned. Dare could have sworn she saw Evelyn among them. Kelin smiled at the moving portrait. "Is this normal for them?" "Dunno. But if this is..." She grabbed his shoulder and pulled. "Let's see what else is here." "No, Dare!" He tried to throw off her hand, but it was too late. They were in the next room. She rounded into an alcove. It was much darker, but gems and lights glittered like stars. Tapestries and jewelry filled the space. A small coronet rested on a velvet pillow on top of a chest-high shelf. All the art and items boasted similar patterns with sleek, endless formations. She picked up the small crown and twirled it in her hands. An emerald was set in the center, surrounded by a thick line of blue that weaved throughout the coronet. "What's wrong with its gems?" Kelin asked. They're not cut. It's like they were melted." "Questing for treasure?" a voice queried from behind. They spun around, and Dare nearly dropped the coronet. A pale Caleb leaned against the wall of the alcove. He shuffled forward. "You've got a good eye, then, because Palin's items are not easy to come by these days." "Caleb!" Dare took 2 steps toward him before remembering to set the coronet back on the pillow. "Palin's," Kelin stuttered, eyeing the treasure laid out before him. The prince offered a weak smile. "Indeed. Poor Palin's. She fought the Kemen first before Indaleria aided her. Then she went on alone to lose to another enemy in another war." He sagged and leaned against the wall. I will always wonder if it was because she hadn't been able to recover from fighting the storm readers first. Dare checked the archways and corners. Shouldn't you have guards or something? He smiled wanly. They think I'm sleeping. Pain as orders, but I couldn't. Kelin's gaze hadn't budged. Are these truly relics of the Paladin Empire? Yes. Caleb pushed himself away from the wall. Palin's style is similar to most elvish designs. King Maiden himself was elven, but there are some distinct differences. He gestured to the coronet. We tend to prefer more wood and stone, and Palin's used more metals. However, the main dissimilarity is in the use of gems. We saw that there was something different, Dare acknowledged. Very much so. We elves cut the gems so they reflect light. We even make pictures into them, but Palin's rarely used cut gems at all. Kelin tilted his head. What did they do with them? Caleb smiled. They had a way of melting them into whatever pattern or shape they wanted, and somehow getting them to act as prisms, too. It's beautiful. Even we don't know how they did it. Dare picked up the sparkling coronet again and studied it. She ran her fingers over it to find a bump or maybe an air bubble. Damn, it's flawless. She looked up at the prince and her eyes widened. I'm holding a remnant of the Empire. I'm going to break it, I know my luck. He offered a tired grin. In that case, you'll have to find another relic of Palin's to replace it. Where do I go? Sounds like an adventure. She set the coronet back on its pillow. She found herself smiling as she glanced at the treasure and the art around the room. This place is nothing like I ever imagined. Take that tree growing in the window over there. It's obviously meant to be there. The entire window and wall were part of a larger, intentional theme that included the tree, the plants, and the ivy, both real and painted. Kelin said, I don't want to use the word streets, that's too mundane. But all the avenues and walkways are so wide. The prince leaned against the wall and exhaled. I'm glad that you find our little haven exciting. Yeah, Kelin agreed. I don't think Dare's feet have touched the ground yet. She raised an eyebrow. I've never had my feet on the ground. I know how you feel, Caleb agreed. We'll find ground, though, and hit it running. She grinned. And kicking. He turned at a noise behind them to see a patrol making its rounds throughout the city. He shook his head and moved to hide his face. Patrols in an elven home. I'll never get used to it. Dare looked over his shoulders at the elves. They looked like soldiers to her. They walked in step, and even their solemn faces matched each other's exactly. Every one of them carried a sword, a bow, and a quiver. Most of them were men, but a few women marched with them. Caleb muttered something in Elvish under his breath. Dare blinked. Well, that was rather rude. The prince stared at her. How in the corners of hell did you understand that? She blushed. The physician gave me the language when he healed me. I didn't ask for it. And Kelin, too. Oh. He dropped his shoulders. You wouldn't have been in that position if We're here now. Dare looked at Caleb. And we're fine. Kelin shivered. Some of us aren't made of steel, Dare. I wish we were, Caleb whispered. We elves do not have a standing army. Yes, we have guards and some knights, but even they have other lives. Makes sense, I suppose, especially with all the magic you have guarding your kingdom, Kelin mused. Caleb grunted, which has its flaws, as we know now. Dare glanced away, and her gaze wandered back to the artifacts from the Paladin Empire. The palm of her hand rested on the velvet pillow. I didn't realize how different we are. You knew all along. The prince met her gaze. I wasn't aware of how similar we are until I came to know you and Kelin. Thank you, Kelin said. Dare shook her head. But you live so much better. It's not fair. Your camp was normal enough, but this place is beautiful. I mean, you have things from Palin's. Why can't humans live like this? Just a spoonful of this could do us wonders. It's not medicine, Dare. Caleb dropped his gaze. And I doubt everyone would share your enthusiasm. The other humans I met, weren't so accommodating. Kelin nudged her arm. They can't force it on us, Dare. That's how enemies are made. And these things can't be easy for even the elves to make, let alone enough for all of humanity. But she let her arms hang limply. Forcing is exactly what the Kelin do, Caleb whispered. They are a force. On people, on the land, and I don't think we can stop them. She shifted her weight in the ensuing silence. Kelin recalled, when we would gather firewood, my mother also used to tell me that nature was about balance. So wouldn't the Kelin be the natural balance to the elves? Both Dare and Caleb stared. The prince finally shook his head. No. There are so many differences that don't balance out. The Kelin created themselves, while we elves were always this way. And besides, the Kelin outnumber us. Offspring are a resource to them, not a family. Dare shook her head. Thistle cares about his son. Caleb wrung his hands together. Thistle seems different. I wish I could believe he is. True Storm Readers would never have a child such as Thalon. They can't share being Storm Readers. Is this all a plot? Dare shrugged, looking uneasy. I don't know what to think. The prince's shoulders slouched. And now, to me, not all life is sacred anymore. That belief has simply died. He pressed a hand against his chest. Dare sucked in her breath. Beside her, Kelin's eyes widened. Caleb plunged on. You don't know how much effort it took me to say that aloud, and I never could to anyone else here. He gasped. It's so hard to say, but it's something so easy to think over and over. And now I want to kill the Storm Readers just because they are Storm Readers. He hung his head. I'm horrible. I don't think you do, Dare whispered. You've spared Thistle. Is that a mistake, though? Caleb hung his head. I'm not so sure we have learned from our own past. The prince's eyes burned. But for what the Storm Readers did, we can't forget that. They murdered so many to achieve immortality. Kelin shook his head. I still can't comprehend that. The Chentham Wars killed more people than are alive today. Dare saw that Kelin couldn't meet the elf's eyes. He swallowed. Why didn't you stop it before they were immortal? When they were killing... Caleb paled and his voice was smaller. We didn't know. He held up his hands. Perhaps we should have, but we didn't until it was too late. That's what my father taught me. But when they turned on the elves, we banished them to Darkreign. Darkreign? Kelin repeated. We've heard the name, but... He trailed off and shook his head. That's how it translates into common. But that's not what they call it. Caleb's voice lowered. They call it home. He sighed. But no one is supposed to leave. That's the law. He held out his hands, palms up. It may have been the wrong decision, but I don't think there was a right one. Not then and probably not even now. He wheezed and stared ahead at nothing. Dare reached out and patted his shoulder. Kelin raised his hand. If it's a magically sealed realm or whatever, how are they banished there? Caleb flattened his lips. The Baroness of Aloin. She did it at my father's command. I can only assume that they must still fear her. Dare shrugged. Well, if she's still around, then why can't she do it again? Caleb shrugged and sighed. Palin's isn't here to help this time. He turned and walked away, and they followed. They passed through corridors of trees, arched over the street like interlocked fingers. Sunlight trickled through the branches and set the autumn colors alight. The small stream that wound through the haven meandered by them, and they crossed a wooden bridge with 4 strong, living trees as posts. Once on the other side, a mural that overlooked the heart of the vista drew Dare's eyes. She drifted in front of the painting. "This is your family." She gazed at the 4 still figures. They were so lifelike that she swore they could have stepped right off the wall. Caleb was younger, and she couldn't ever recall seeing her friend smiling that happily in life. "Yes." The prince pressed a hand against his brother's face. Her eyes lingered on King Valadin. He seemed to be an older Caleb. The crown on his head was sleek and bright, rising to sharp points. Cut gems flowed around it like braided streams. In the center was a jewel, but it appeared gold. Kelin hovered his fingers over the art. "I think I could walk into this painting." Dare's eyes studied the face of the late king. Then she turned to Caleb. "This is truly you, then. The crown prince, soon to be the king of the elves." He leaned against the wall, clutching his arms to his chest. "It was never meant to be. My father was supposed to outlive his kingdom." He started to lift his gaze to the images, but then dropped away. "It seems your destiny has arrived instead." She stepped back from the mural. Caleb's lip trembled. "I don't want it. I want my mother and father." He rubbed his face. "I can't be a child ruler to a race of immortals." He clutched his arms to his chest. "They have said nothing, but I see the way they watch me." "You worried about your back?" Dare's nose wrinkled. Caleb shook his head, but then paused and nodded. "What if there is a traitor? Why? What does he want? Does he not realize what floodgates he's opened?" She shrugged. "You're always free to run away with us." Kelin's eyes bulged. "Excuse me?" Caleb stared. Then a ghost of a smile graced his face. "Thank you. But—" She chuckled. "If it's any consolation, we're also completely unsure of where we're going to go and what to do." "Hey." Kelin crossed his arms, and Dare saw him trying not to grin. "I'm a blacksmith, Dare. You're the soldier with no training, army, or allegiance." "Yeah, but—" She kicked her toe against the ground. "I have friends." Caleb seemed to freeze, but then he nodded and smiled. "And so do I. But first I need to know my brother is safe at least. He could never survive in human lands." "You did," Dare pointed out. "I am not my brother." She grinned. "Yeah, he's not the one taking advice from a mortal, penniless warrior." "You're hardly penniless, Dare." "No, I am." She patted her trousers. "I have absolutely no money on me." Kelin sighed. "But you have the future king of the elves as a friend." Caleb's expression mellowed. "If we don't die horribly. And I will not be the king of all elves." Kelin rolled his eyes and tried to hide a small smile. "I'm sorry, king of the elven kingdom. You'll be the most powerful man alive." Caleb frowned. "That will not be accurate." After a moment of silence, Dare watched him gaze at his family. He traced his fingers over his father's face. "We lost his crown." He gulped and looked away. "I'm sure it's destroyed by now." He shook his head. "But the lives of everyone are more important than some jewelry I never wanted." "I am so very sorry for you," she said. "Thank you." Caleb closed his eyes. "But it's nothing. I have to stay this time." Dare shook her head. "It's not nothing. It was your father's crown. It's what you would have had that's left of him." He kept his eyes shut. "I wish the Kimmin had stayed gone, because then we wouldn't have to do something so horrible as take lives, or lose ours." He looked back up at them, his eyes watering with unshed tears. I fear that to survive we'll have to commit another tragedy, and I'm terrified that part of me wants to." Kelin and Dare exchanged an uneasy glance. He shrugged at her and she held up her empty hands, unsure of what to say. Caleb turned to face them, putting his back to the mural. They're gone, and so are those on the river. He exhaled and raised a hand toward the center of the haven. So please, enjoy what luxuries we have while we still draw breath ourselves. Caleb, Dare started. He sniffed. And maybe even get a bath. Kelin snorted and smirked. Well, I don't think you're wrong on that. He dipped his head. The absolute worst part is that I not only have to show bravery when I don't feel it, but that I actually have to be brave. Dare grinned. And you have been. Ain't nothing to it after you fall a couple of times. Kelin rolled his eyes. Caleb looked at Dare with a mix of confusion and exasperation. Well, anyway, I've got a meeting to attend. But you? He smiled. You get to relax. I'm envious.